Imagine for a moment an object so important that an entire people carried it through the wilderness as a sign that heaven was still with them. An object said to contain sacred law, divine presence, and a kind of power that was treated with reverence, fear, and exacting care. The Ark of the Covenant sits in that unusual space between history and mystery, between scripture and speculation, between what has been preserved in ancient texts and what has been lost to time. And tonight, we are going to examine it carefully, not as fantasy, not as pure legend, and not as a shortcut to wild conclusions, but as one of the most enduring mysteries in religious history. Before we begin, subscribe to Sleepy Tin Foil Hat if you enjoy these calm, deep explorations into the world's most intriguing mysteries, and let me know where you're listening from tonight. I always like to imagine these conversations drifting out into the dark from different cities, different countries, different time zones, while all of us, in our own quiet corners of the world, follow the same trail into the unknown. Because the Ark is exactly that kind of subject. On one level, the mainstream explanation is clear enough. In the Hebrew Bible, the Ark of the Covenant is a sacred chest built according to divine instructions, made to house the tablets of the law given to Moses, and carried by the Israelites as a central object of worship and covenant identity. That alone would make it historically and spiritually significant. But then there is the other side of the story, the reason the Ark has never stopped pulling at the imagination. If it was real, what exactly was it? Where did it go? Why is its treatment in the text so unusually charged, almost technical at times, as if its handling involved more than symbolic ritual? And why, after being one of the most important objects in the biblical world, does it seem to vanish from the historical record with a silence that feels almost deliberate? To begin where we should begin, with the mainstream view, the Ark is introduced in the book of Exodus as part of a larger set of instructions given to Moses. It is described as a chest made of acacia wood and overlaid with gold, fitted with rings and poles for carrying, and topped with what is often translated as a mercy seat, flanked by 2 cherubim. Inside, according to biblical tradition, were placed the tablets of the covenant, and in later references, possibly other sacred items associated with Israel's journey and priesthood. In the mainstream religious and historical reading, the Ark is not a machine, not a weapon in the modern sense, and not an alien device, but a cultic object of the highest order, the central symbol of divine covenant between God and Israel. In the ancient Near East, sacred objects and portable shrines were not unusual. Many cultures had ritual objects, ceremonial chests, or divine standards associated with gods and kings. In that sense, the Ark fits into a recognizable ancient pattern, though it stands out because of the intensity of its theological meaning in the biblical text. It is not merely a container, it is treated as a focal point of divine presence, and that for many historians is where the mystery starts to become more interesting rather than less. Because even if we remove later exaggeration and speculative reinterpretation, we are still left with an object that occupied an extraordinary place in ancient consciousness. The biblical narratives around the Ark are striking because they do not describe it in the quiet, decorative language we might expect if it were just a revered artifact sitting safely in a temple corner. The Ark moves through the story almost like an active force. It is carried before the Israelites in moments of crisis. It appears in the crossing of the Jordan. It is associated with the fall of Jericho in one of the Bible's most famous and contested stories. It is feared by enemies and treated with layers of caution by its own caretakers. One of the most memorable moments comes in the story of Uzzah, who reaches out to steady the Ark when the oxen stumble and is struck down. Mainstream theology usually interprets that episode as a lesson in holiness, obedience, and the danger of approaching the sacred on human terms rather than divine terms. In other words, the danger is spiritual and moral, not technological. But it is also understandable why later readers, especially modern readers shaped by science and engineering, have looked at those same descriptions and felt an unusual tension in them. Why so much emphasis on proper handling? Why the poles, the restrictions, the distance, the warnings? Why does contact matter so much? Is this simply the language of ritual purity taken with total seriousness? Or does the text preserve, in symbolic form, an older memory of something treated as physically dangerous? That is where alternative interpretations begin, and to handle them responsibly, we need to slow down. One speculative line of thinking suggests that the Ark may have been remembered not only as a sacred chest, but as an object associated with phenomena ancient people could experience but not explain in scientific terms. Some have proposed electrical effects, static discharge, or ritualized practices built around conductive metals and dry desert conditions. Others have imagined the Ark as a kind of ceremonial device whose power became mythologized over generations. Still others have taken the speculation much further, suggesting advanced lost technology or contact with something beyond conventional history. Now, the careful point here is that there is no solid historical evidence that the Ark was a literal machine or advanced device. That must be stated clearly. The mainstream academic view does not support those conclusions. But the reason the speculation persists is not simply because people enjoy mystery. It is because the descriptions can feel oddly precise in places and strangely severe in their consequences. The Ark is not handled casually. It is not viewed casually. It is not written about casually. So the alternative perspective does not begin with certainty. It begins with a question. Why does this object seem to generate such a unique atmosphere of danger, reverence, and controlled access compared with many other sacred items in the biblical world? Another layer of the mystery is the Ark's possible historical reality. Outside the Bible, direct evidence for the Ark is frustratingly thin. This is not unusual in ancient history, where many important objects and events are known primarily through texts rather than surviving artifacts. Organic materials decay, temples are destroyed, cities are looted, and sacred treasures are among the first things to disappear during conquest. The lack of surviving evidence does not prove the Ark never existed, but it does create a difficult space where belief, history, and speculation all press against each other. Some scholars think the Ark may well reflect a real cult object from early Israelite religion, later framed within theological narratives. Others think the biblical descriptions may combine memory, symbolism, and literary shaping over centuries. That distinction matters, because if the Ark as described in Scripture is partly historical and partly theological, then the real ancient object, assuming there was one, might have been both less sensational and more interesting than later imagination suggests. It may have been a genuine ritual chest that acquired layers of sacred meaning as Israel's traditions developed, or it may have been a singular national relic whose exact appearance and function became increasingly idealized over time. Either possibility leaves room for mystery without requiring fantasy. Then, of course, there is the question that never quite goes away. Where did it go? This is perhaps the most magnetic part of the Ark's story. The reason it remains not only a religious symbol, but a historical obsession. In the biblical account, the Ark is eventually housed in the temple in Jerusalem, the great center of worship built by Solomon. But when the Babylonians destroy Jerusalem and the temple in the 6th century BCE, the Ark is not clearly listed among the captured temple treasures in the way we might expect. It simply fades from the record. That silence has produced centuries of theories. The mainstream explanation is often the simplest. It may have been destroyed, looted, hidden, or lost during the turmoil surrounding the Babylonian conquest. Ancient wars were chaotic. Records were incomplete. Sacred objects vanished all the time. Yet because the Ark was so central, Many readers have found it difficult to accept that it could disappear so completely. That discomfort opens the door to other possibilities. Was it hidden before the conquest? Was it removed by priests? Was it taken elsewhere and preserved in secret? Did later traditions grow around a loss that no one wanted to admit or could no longer explain? This is where one of the most famous alternative traditions enters the conversation, the claim that the Ark ended up in Ethiopia. According to Ethiopian Christian tradition, especially as preserved in later texts like the Kebra Nagast, the Ark was brought to Ethiopia long ago and is kept there under protection. In the mainstream historical view, this tradition is deeply important culturally and religiously, but it is not accepted as proven evidence for the Ark's location. The tradition emerges much later than the biblical period and is intertwined with dynastic and theological identity. Still, it has endured powerfully, and that endurance itself is worth noticing, because mysteries like this do not survive merely on the absence of evidence. They survive because communities build meaning around them, guard them, transmit them, and sometimes make them part of a living sacred geography. Even if a historian remains skeptical, the Ethiopian tradition tells us something profound about how the Ark continued to live in human imagination long after it disappeared from the central biblical narrative. And the same is true of other theories, from hidden chambers beneath Jerusalem to remote caves, priestly concealment, or vanished temple networks. Most of these ideas remain unproven. Some are much stronger than others. But all of them grow from the same root problem. An object portrayed as central in one era becomes strangely unreachable in the next. There is also a subtler mystery here, and it may be the one that lingers longest after the louder theories fade. Why does the Ark, among so many ancient sacred objects, still command this level of fascination? Part of the answer is obvious. It combines religion, lost history, forbidden access, and disappearance. But part of it may be that the Ark represents a deeper human tension. It symbolizes the possibility that the ancient world knew how to frame certain experiences in ways we no longer fully understand. Not because ancient people possessed secret science in the sensational sense, but because they lived in a universe where symbol, ritual, law, memory, power, and presence were not easily separated. To modern minds, we tend to divide everything into categories. A box is a box, a ritual is a ritual, a text is a text. But in the biblical imagination, the Ark was not just an item among items. It was the meeting point of covenant, authority, danger, legitimacy, and divine nearness. To touch it wrongly was not only a physical act, it was a collapse of order. To carry it properly was not only transportation, it was theology in motion. And perhaps that is why it still feels so charged. The Ark is not mysterious only because it is missing. It is mysterious because even when described, it seems to mean more than the description can comfortably hold. So in part 1, what we have done is set the table carefully. The mainstream explanation tells us that the Ark of the Covenant was a sacred object of ancient Israel, central to worship and identity, remembered through Scripture as the vessel of divine covenant and presence. That is the grounding point, and it matters. But once that foundation is laid, the unanswered questions become impossible to ignore. The descriptions are unusually intense. The handling rules feel severe. The historical trail goes cold. The disappearance is unresolved. And the later traditions are wide, persistent, and often deeply sincere. None of that proves the more speculative theories. But it does explain why those theories keep returning. Because when an object sits at the intersection of reverence and absence, the mind begins to circle around it. Not to invent wildly, but to ask whether something important has been lost beneath the layers of text, ritual, empire, and time. And that is where our exploration begins. Not with certainty, but with attention. Not with conclusions, but with questions. The Ark of the Covenant may ultimately be a matter of faith, history, or both. But either way, it remains one of the great unfinished mysteries of the ancient world, and the deeper we look, the more we start to notice that what survives is not just the story of a sacred object, but the outline of a silence around it. As we move a little deeper into this quiet investigation, it helps to slow down and focus not on where the ark might be, but on what the descriptions themselves are really telling us. Because sometimes, the most revealing clues are not hidden in dramatic events or missing records, but in the small, repeated details that ancient writers chose to preserve. When you read the passages describing the ark in the book of Exodus, what stands out is not just reverence, but precision. The dimensions are given, the materials are specified. The method of transport is fixed. Even the way it is to be approached is controlled with an almost procedural strictness. From a mainstream perspective, this makes perfect sense within the context of ancient religious practice. Sacred objects were not treated casually. They were governed by rules that reinforced hierarchy, holiness, and separation between the divine and the ordinary. The ark, being the most sacred object, would naturally have the most detailed instructions. This is consistent with what we see in other parts of the ancient Near East, where temples, statues, and ritual implements were often subject to careful handling and restricted access, especially by priestly classes. In that sense, the ark is not an anomaly. It fits into a broader cultural pattern where sacredness is expressed through boundaries, and those boundaries are enforced through ritual law. But even within that framework, there are moments where the tone shifts slightly, where the language feels less like symbolic instruction and more like a warning embedded in narrative. The ark is not only sacred, it is described as something that must not be touched directly. It is carried with poles inserted through rings, ensuring that no human hand comes into direct contact with it during transport. The priests who handle it are given specific roles, and even they operate within defined limits. In the mainstream view, this is about preserving ritual purity and maintaining respect for the divine presence. Contact is restricted because the ark represents something beyond human control, and to approach it improperly is to violate that order. Yet the consistency of the restriction raises a quiet question. Why such an emphasis on physical separation, even in moments of urgency? Why design a system where the object is never directly handled, even by those entrusted with its care? This question becomes more interesting when we consider the materials involved. The ark is described as being made of acacia wood overlaid with gold, both inside and out. Gold, in ancient contexts, is often associated with value, beauty, and incorruptibility. It does not tarnish easily, it reflects light, and it carries symbolic weight across cultures. But gold is also a conductor of electricity, and while it would be anachronistic to suggest that ancient Israelites understood conductivity in modern scientific terms, it is still worth noting how the physical properties of materials can intersect with ritual design. Some alternative interpretations have suggested that the combination of wood, metal, and dry environmental conditions could, under certain circumstances, create static electrical effects. Again, there is no solid historical evidence that the ark was designed as an electrical device, and we should not leap to that conclusion. But the observation itself is not entirely without grounding. Ancient people were familiar with unusual natural phenomena, even if they described them in symbolic or theological language. Static shocks, luminous effects, or unexpected reactions to materials might not have been understood scientifically, but they would have been experienced, remembered, and possibly integrated into ritual caution. This is where the careful approach matters most. Instead of asking, was the ark a machine? Which pushes us too quickly into speculative territory, it may be more useful to ask, could the descriptions reflect an attempt to manage something that behaved in ways people found dangerous or unpredictable? That question does not require advanced technology or lost civilizations. It simply acknowledges that ancient texts sometimes preserve observations filtered through symbolic language. If an object was associated with intense experiences, whether psychological, environmental, or ritual, it might be described in ways that emphasize both its power and its danger. And over time, those descriptions could become more formalized, more codified, until they appear as strict commandments rather than remembered precautions. Another detail worth noticing is the ark's role in movement. Unlike many sacred objects that remain fixed in temples, the ark travels. It is carried through the wilderness, into battles, across rivers, and eventually into the heart of Jerusalem. In the mainstream understanding, this reflects the early history of Israel as a people in transition, not yet settled, carrying their central symbol of divine presence with them as they move from place to place. This portability is part of its meaning. It suggests that the divine is not confined to a single location, but accompanies the people. That interpretation is well supported within biblical theology. But there is also something practically intriguing about the way the ark is transported. It is not placed on a cart in the usual sense, at least not according to the ideal instructions. It is carried on poles by designated individuals, maintaining a certain distance between the object and the ground, between the object and direct human contact. When that system is violated, as in the story of Uzzah, the consequences are immediate and severe. From a purely narrative standpoint, this reinforces the theme of obedience and reverence. But if we step back slightly, we can also see a pattern of controlled interaction. The ark is always mediated through layers: poles, carriers, priests, rituals. It is never casually integrated into ordinary space. It moves, but it moves within a carefully defined system. And that system seems designed not only to honor it, but to manage it. This dual function, reverence and control, appears repeatedly in the text. The ark is placed in the innermost part of the tabernacle, later the temple, separated by veils, accessible only to specific individuals at specific times. The closer one gets to it, the more restricted the access becomes. Again, this aligns with ancient religious practice, where inner sanctuaries were reserved for priests and high priests. But the intensity of the restriction, combined with the narratives of danger, creates an atmosphere that feels slightly different from mere symbolism. It feels as though proximity itself is significant in a more immediate way. There is also the question of how the ark is perceived by those outside the Israelite community. In the biblical narrative, when the ark is captured by the Philistines, it is placed in the temple of their god, and a series of misfortunes follows. Their idol falls, plagues break out, and the ark is eventually returned out of fear. The mainstream interpretation sees this as a theological statement about the supremacy of Israel's God over other deities. It is a narrative designed to reinforce belief and identity. But even here, the pattern remains consistent. The ark is associated with effects that extend beyond symbolic meaning. It is not neutral in the presence of others. It changes the environment, at least within the story. And once again, whether one reads this as theology, literary shaping, or memory of unusual events, the result is the same. The ark is never passive. It is always active in some sense, even if that activity is understood differently depending on perspective. As we sit with these details, a quieter idea begins to form, one that does not depend on dramatic conclusions. Perhaps the ark represents a convergence of several layers of human experience. On one level, it is a sacred object, constructed and used within a specific religious tradition. On another level, it may preserve traces of how ancient people interacted with materials, environments, and phenomena they did not fully explain, but learned to respect. And on yet another level, it becomes a symbol that grows over time, absorbing meaning, authority, and mystery as it moves through history and text. When we read about the Ark today, we are not encountering a single, simple object. We are encountering a layered memory, shaped by ritual, narrative, and the passage of centuries. This layered quality may also explain why the Ark resists simple answers. If it were purely symbolic, we might expect its descriptions to be less detailed. If it were purely physical, we might expect clearer historical traces. Instead, it sits in between, detailed enough to feel real, elusive enough to remain unresolved. And that in-between space is where speculation naturally grows, not because people are careless with history, but because the available information invites careful questioning. When the rules are strict, the consequences are severe, and the disappearance is unexplained, it becomes difficult not to wonder whether there is more beneath the surface. So as we move forward, it is important to keep our balance. The goal is not to turn the Ark into something it was never meant to be, nor to dismiss the mystery simply because it is uncomfortable. The goal is to hold both sides in view at the same time. On one side, we have the mainstream understanding, grounded in theology, history, and cultural context. On the other, we have a set of observations that do not fit neatly into simple categories. The emphasis on physical separation, the repeated warnings, the unusual narratives of consequence, and the complete disappearance from the historical record. Each of these elements, on its own, might not mean much, but together, they form a pattern. And patterns, even subtle ones, are often where deeper questions begin. In this part, we have not tried to solve the mystery. Instead, we have taken a closer look at the structure of the story itself, the way the Ark is described, handled, and experienced within the text. And already, without leaving the boundaries of careful analysis, we can feel that something about it is different. Something that invites us to keep looking, to keep asking, to keep examining the space between what is clearly stated and what is quietly implied. Because sometimes, the most interesting discoveries are not found in what is hidden outright, but in what is repeated so consistently that we stop noticing how unusual it really is. As we continue, it becomes useful to shift our attention slightly, away from the object itself and toward the environment in which it existed, because objects, especially ones surrounded by such intense meaning, rarely exist in isolation. They are part of systems, systems of belief, systems of power, systems of ritual, and understanding those systems can sometimes reveal more than focusing on the object alone. In the case of the Ark of the Covenant, one of the most important contexts is the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary described in the Hebrew Bible as the dwelling place of divine presence during the Israelites' journey through the wilderness. In the mainstream view, the tabernacle is a carefully structured sacred space, designed according to divine instructions, with different layers of access that reflect increasing levels of holiness. The outer areas are accessible to more people, while the inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, is restricted to the high priest, and even then, only under specific conditions and at specific times. The Ark is placed at the very center of this structure, not just physically, but symbolically. It is the focal point around which everything else is arranged. This arrangement is not unusual in ancient religious architecture. Many cultures created sacred spaces with layers, where proximity to the divine was carefully controlled. Temples in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and elsewhere often had inner chambers reserved for priests, sometimes housing statues or symbols of the deity. So in the mainstream academic understanding, the tabernacle, and later the temple in Jerusalem, reflect a broader pattern of sacred design, adapted to the specific theology of ancient Israel. The Ark, in this sense, is not an anomaly, but the most important element within a familiar type of structure. However, when we look more closely at the descriptions, we begin to notice that the separation around the Ark is particularly strict. even by ancient standards. The Holy of Holies is not just restricted, it is almost completely inaccessible. The high priest enters only once a year, during a specific ritual, and even then under carefully prescribed conditions involving incense, garments, and offerings. The idea is not merely that the space is sacred, but that it is potentially overwhelming, even dangerous if approached incorrectly. From a theological perspective, this is often interpreted as a reflection of divine holiness. The presence associated with the ark is understood as so pure, so intense, that ordinary human beings cannot encounter it directly without consequence. This interpretation is internally consistent within the religious framework of the text, but it also raises an interesting parallel question. How do human societies typically respond to things they experience as both powerful and not fully understood? One common pattern, observable across cultures, is the development of structured access. When something is perceived as dangerous or sacred, or both, it is surrounded by rules, roles, and rituals that regulate interaction. These systems serve multiple purposes. They protect individuals, they reinforce authority, and they transform unpredictable experiences into controlled practices. In that sense, the tabernacle can be seen not only as a place of worship, but as a system of management, a way of organizing how people approach something they believe to be beyond ordinary experience. This brings us to an interesting overlap between mainstream interpretation and more speculative thinking. Both recognize that the ark is associated with something intense, something that requires careful handling. Where they differ is in how that intensity is understood. The mainstream view sees it as entirely theological, rooted in the concept of divine presence. The alternative perspective asks whether the descriptions might also reflect encounters with phenomena that were experienced physically, even if interpreted spiritually. Again, this does not mean that the ark was a piece of advanced technology, and it is important not to jump to that conclusion. But it does open a quieter line of inquiry. Could the rituals and restrictions be serving a dual function, expressing reverence while also encoding practical precautions? Could the language of holiness be, in part, a way of describing interactions that felt real, immediate, and potentially harmful? One detail that often receives less attention, but becomes more intriguing the longer you sit with it, is the use of incense when entering the Holy of Holies. According to the biblical instructions, the high priest is to bring a cloud of incense into the inner chamber, partially obscuring the ark. In the mainstream interpretation, this has symbolic meaning, representing purification, prayer, and the presence of the divine. Incense is a common element in many religious traditions, used to create atmosphere and signify sacredness. But there is also a practical effect. Incense produces smoke, alters the air, and changes the sensory environment of a space. It limits visibility, it can affect breathing, and it creates a kind of buffer between the observer and whatever is being approached. From a purely observational standpoint, this is interesting. Why obscure the ark at the very moment it is being approached most closely? Is it purely symbolic, or could it also serve to mediate the experience in some way? We can also consider the garments worn by the high priest. These are described in detail, with specific materials, layers, and components. In the mainstream view, these garments are ceremonial, representing status, identity, and obedience to divine instruction. They distinguish the high priest from others and mark the seriousness of the ritual. But as with the other elements, there is a practical dimension worth noticing. Specialized clothing can serve protective functions, even if those functions are not understood in modern scientific terms. In many ancient contexts, ritual attire is both symbolic and functional, designed to prepare the individual for a specific type of interaction. Once again, we are not claiming hidden technology or lost science. We are simply observing that the system surrounding the ark is comprehensive. It controls space, access, visibility, movement, and even the physical state of the person who approaches it. As we continue to follow this line of thought, another pattern begins to emerge, one that extends beyond the tabernacle itself. The ark is consistently associated with transition points, moments where boundaries are crossed or established. When the Israelites cross the Jordan River, the ark is carried ahead of them, and the waters are said to part. When they march around Jericho, the ark is present as part of the ritual that precedes the city's fall. In each case, the ark is positioned at the edge between one state and another. Wilderness and settlement, outside and inside, uncertainty and resolution. In the mainstream reading, this reinforces its role as a symbol of divine guidance and power. It is not the ark itself that causes events, but what it represents, the presence and will of God moving with the people. Yet the repetition of this positioning is striking. The ark appears at thresholds, at moments where something shifts, where the ordinary flow of events is interrupted. From a narrative perspective, this makes sense. Stories often highlight key objects at critical moments. But from an analytical perspective, it invites us to consider how meaning is assigned. When an object is consistently present at moments of change, it becomes associated with change itself. Over time, that association can deepen until the object is seen not just as a symbol of transition, but as an active participant in it. This does not mean the ark literally caused rivers to stop or walls to fall, but it does suggest that its role in the narrative is carefully constructed, reinforcing a pattern that links it with transformation, boundary crossing, and the reordering of space. Now, if we bring all of these observations together, the controlled access, the layered environment, the use of incense, the specialized garments, the emphasis on distance, and the ark's presence at critical moments, we begin to see something that feels less like a single mystery and more like a system of meaning. The ark is at the center of that system, but the system itself is what gives it its full significance. And systems, especially ancient ones, are rarely simple. They evolve, they adapt, and they accumulate layers of interpretation over time. What may have started as a physical object with specific functions becomes, over generations, a symbol, a story, a point of identity, and eventually, a mystery. This perspective also helps us understand why the ark's disappearance is so unsettling. It is not just the loss of an object, it is the loss of the center of a system. When the temple is destroyed and the ark is no longer present, something fundamental changes in the structure of worship and identity. The system has to adapt. New forms of practice emerge, new interpretations develop, and the absence itself becomes part of the story. In a way, the ark continues to exist not as a physical object, but as a conceptual anchor, something that defines what has been lost and what is still remembered. And perhaps this is where the calm, careful approach leads us in this part. Instead of asking whether the ark was something extraordinary in a modern sense, we can ask whether it was extraordinary in the context of the system that surrounded it. Was it the focal point of one of the most carefully structured and tightly controlled ritual environments in the ancient world? Did it sit at the intersection of belief, experience, and authority in a way that made it uniquely powerful, regardless of its physical properties? And if so, does that help explain why its story has endured, not because of what it might secretly be, but because of what it clearly represented within its original context? As we let these questions settle, the mystery does not disappear, but it becomes more grounded. It becomes less about dramatic possibilities and more about subtle patterns, about the way human beings build meaning around objects, protect them, regulate access to them, and carry them through time until they become something larger than themselves. The Ark of the Covenant, in this light, is not just a lost artifact. It is a window into how ancient people understood presence, power, and the boundaries between the seen and the unseen. And the more we look at it this way, the more we begin to realize that the real mystery may not be what the Ark was made of, or where it went, but how it came to hold such a central, enduring place in human thought. As we move forward, it becomes necessary to gently turn our attention toward one of the most persistent and quietly compelling aspects of this mystery. And that is not just how the Ark was described or used, but how its story begins to fragment as history progresses. Up to a certain point in the biblical narrative, the Ark feels anchored. It has a role, a location, a function within a living system. It travels, it is housed, it is referenced repeatedly. But then, almost without warning, the clarity begins to fade. The further we move into later periods, the less directly the Ark is mentioned, until eventually it seems to disappear altogether. And what makes this particularly interesting is not just that it disappears, but how it disappears, without a clear conclusion, without a definitive account, and without the kind of detailed explanation we might expect for something so central. In the mainstream historical view, this kind of disappearance is not as unusual as it might seem at first. Ancient history is full of gaps. Records are incomplete, events are lost, and objects of immense importance can vanish in the chaos of war, conquest, and time. When the Babylonians, under King Nebuchadnezzar, destroyed Jerusalem and the First Temple in the 6th century BCE, they took many sacred objects as spoils. This is well documented in both biblical texts and external sources. However, the Ark is notably absent from the detailed lists of captured items. For many historians, the simplest explanation is that the Ark was either destroyed during the siege, hidden before the city fell, or taken without being specifically recorded. In other words, its disappearance may not be mysterious in intent, only in detail. The ancient world did not preserve information with the consistency we expect today, and what seems like a significant omission to us may simply reflect the limitations of the record. But even within that reasonable explanation, there is something that continues to draw attention. The Ark is not a minor artifact. It is not one object among many. It is, within the biblical narrative, the central object of the covenant, the symbolic meeting point between the divine and the people. So when such an object fades from the record without a clear endpoint, it creates a kind of historical tension. Not proof of anything hidden, but a space where questions naturally remain. And into that space, over centuries, a wide range of traditions and theories have emerged, each attempting, in its own way, to resolve the silence. One of the earliest suggestions, found within later biblical and post-biblical traditions, is that the Ark was hidden before the Babylonian conquest. Some texts imply that it may have been concealed by priests who anticipated the fall of Jerusalem, possibly placed in a secure location to protect it from capture. The idea is simple and grounded. Those responsible for safeguarding the most sacred object would not allow it to fall into enemy hands if they had any means of preventing it. This theory does not require extraordinary assumptions. It fits within known human behavior, especially in times of crisis. Sacred objects have been hidden, buried, and protected throughout history during periods of invasion. Yet the difficulty remains the same. If the Ark was hidden, where was it placed, and why was it never recovered or publicly revealed afterward? This is where the narrative begins to branch into multiple directions. Some traditions suggest locations beneath Jerusalem itself, perhaps within hidden chambers or tunnels associated with the temple complex. The idea here is that the Ark never truly left the city, but was concealed in a way that made it inaccessible once the temple was destroyed. From an archaeological perspective, Jerusalem is indeed layered with history, and there are structures beneath structures, remnants beneath remnants. However, modern exploration in such areas is extremely limited due to religious, political, and cultural sensitivities. So while the idea cannot be fully tested, it also cannot be easily confirmed. It remains a possibility, but one that sits quietly in the background, without direct evidence. Other traditions move further outward. Perhaps the most well-known among them is the claim that the Ark was taken to Ethiopia, where it is said to reside in the city of Aksum, guarded within a church and protected from public view. In the mainstream academic perspective, this tradition is respected as an important part of Ethiopian religious identity, but it is not considered historically verified. The accounts describing the Ark's journey to Ethiopia appear centuries after the events they describe, and there is no independent evidence confirming the transfer. Yet the persistence of the tradition is notable. It has endured not just as a story, but as a living belief, maintained with consistency and seriousness over generations. And even if one approaches it with skepticism, the question remains, why did this particular narrative take hold so strongly? And what does that say about how the Ark's absence was understood by different communities? There are also more speculative theories, some suggesting that the Ark was taken far beyond the traditional boundaries of the ancient Near East, possibly carried along trade routes or hidden in distant locations. These ideas tend to move further away from established evidence and into the realm of conjecture. They often rely on indirect connections, symbolic parallels, or interpretations that stretch beyond what the historical record can support. It is important to approach these carefully, not dismissing them outright, but also not granting them more weight than the evidence allows. The pattern we see again and again is that the less information we have, the more space there is for interpretation. And while interpretation can be valuable, it must remain anchored to what can reasonably be known. At the same time, there is another possibility that is often overlooked because it is less dramatic, but perhaps more consistent with how history tends to unfold. It is possible that the Ark was simply lost in a way that left no clear trace. Not hidden intentionally, not transported to a distant land, but destroyed or degraded in circumstances that were not fully recorded. War, fire, looting, and the passage of time can erase even the most significant objects. And in the ancient world, where materials decay and documentation is fragile, such losses are more common than we might like to admit. This explanation does not satisfy the desire for resolution, but it aligns with the broader pattern of how history often works. Important things disappear, and the record moves on without them. Yet even if we accept that possibility, the story does not fully settle. Because the Ark does not disappear from thought, only from sight. It continues to be referenced, imagined, and sought after long after its physical presence is gone. This suggests that its significance had already moved beyond the object itself. It had become an idea, a symbol, something that could persist even in absence. And that transition, from physical artifact to enduring concept, is perhaps one of the most important shifts in the entire story. When we think about it in this way, the Ark's disappearance becomes less of an ending and more of a transformation. While it may no longer exist as a tangible object we can examine, it continues to exist as a focal point of curiosity, belief, and inquiry. And in some ways, that makes it even more powerful. A known object can be studied, measured, and eventually understood. But a missing object, especially one surrounded by detailed descriptions and unresolved questions, remains open. It invites investigation. It resists closure. It stays with us. So as we sit with this part of the story, there is no need to rush toward a conclusion. The Ark may have been hidden, destroyed, relocated, or simply lost. Each possibility has its place within the range of what can be considered. But what matters more, at least for now, is recognizing the pattern. A central object, carefully described, deeply significant, gradually fades from the record, leaving behind a silence that is never fully filled. And in that silence, generation after generation begins to ask the same quiet question, not with certainty, but with curiosity. What happened to it? As we continue, it becomes helpful to shift our attention again, this time toward the moments when the arc is described not just as present, but as active within unfolding events, because this is where the tone of the narrative subtly changes. Up to now, we have looked at its construction, its environment, and its disappearance. But in between those points lies a series of accounts where the arc seems to stand at the center of outcomes that are remembered as extraordinary. And here, more than anywhere else, we need to move carefully, separating what the text clearly presents from how those presentations have been interpreted over time. In the mainstream understanding, the ark is not a source of independent power. It does not act on its own. Instead, it represents the presence and will of God, and the events associated with it are understood as acts of divine intervention. This is the theological foundation of the narrative, and it shapes how each event is framed. When the Israelites carry the ark into the Jordan River and the waters stop, allowing them to cross, the ark is not described as causing the river to part in a mechanical sense. Rather, its presence signals that this is a moment where divine action is taking place. The same applies to the fall of Jericho, where the ark is carried as part of a ritual procession around the city. The walls do not fall because of the ark itself, but because the event is presented as an act of divine will, with the ark serving as the focal symbol of that presence. This interpretation is consistent and internally coherent. It explains why the ark is always treated with such reverence, why it is placed at the center of key moments, and why its presence is associated with outcomes that go beyond ordinary expectation. But at the same time, when we step back and look at the pattern from a more analytical perspective, we begin to notice something else. The ark is consistently positioned at the point where something changes, where a boundary is crossed, where a situation shifts from one state to another. It is there at the edge of the river. It is there at the walls of a fortified city. It is there when battles are fought, when decisions are made, when transitions occur. And over time, this repeated association creates a kind of narrative gravity around the object. From a storytelling standpoint, this makes sense. Important objects are often placed at the center of important moments. But from a deeper perspective, it raises a subtle question about how meaning is constructed. When an object is repeatedly present at moments of transformation, does it begin to feel as though it is part of the cause, even if it is officially described as a symbol? And if that feeling is strong enough, does it influence how later generations interpret those events? This is where alternative interpretations begin to emerge, not as claims, but as questions. Some have wondered whether the ark's presence in these events reflects more than symbolic importance. Could there have been physical effects, environmental factors, or psychological influences that contributed to how these moments were experienced and remembered? For example, when large groups of people participate in coordinated ritual actions, marching, chanting, focusing their attention on a central object, it can create powerful collective experiences. These experiences can feel overwhelming, transformative, and even otherworldly, especially in societies where the boundary between the physical and the spiritual is not sharply defined. Over time, such experiences can become embedded in narrative form, described in ways that emphasize their significance and intensity. Again, this does not require us to assume anything beyond what is already known about human behavior and memory. It simply suggests that events associated with the ark may have been experienced in ways that felt extraordinary, and those experiences were then preserved through the language available at the time. The ark, being the central object in these moments, becomes inseparable from the memory of what occurred. It is not that the ark itself must be redefined as something else, but that its role in shaping perception and meaning may have been more complex than a simple object in the background. Another aspect worth considering is the ark's role in warfare. In several accounts, the Ark is carried into battle or positioned in ways that connect it directly to military outcomes. In the mainstream interpretation, this reflects the belief that victory comes from divine support, and the Ark serves as a visible reminder of that support. It reinforces morale, unity, and a sense of purpose among those who carry it. This is not unusual in ancient warfare. Armies often carried symbols, standards, or sacred objects into battle as a way of invoking protection and strengthening resolve. But the Ark stands out because of how strongly it is associated with both success and danger. When it is treated properly, it is linked to victory. When it is handled incorrectly or approached without the proper conditions, the consequences are severe. This dual nature, protective and dangerous, adds another layer to its profile. It is not simply a comforting symbol. It is something that demands respect at all times. And this again brings us back to the pattern we have seen before. The Ark is always surrounded by control. It is never neutral. It is never ordinary. It exists within a framework that emphasizes both its importance and its potential to disrupt. One of the most striking examples of this is the account of the Ark being captured by the Philistines. In the narrative, they take the Ark as a trophy of war, placing it in the temple of their own god. But instead of bringing them advantage, it is followed by a series of unsettling events: statues falling, illness spreading, and a growing sense that the object they have taken is not something they can control. In the mainstream view, this is a theological statement about the superiority of one god over another, expressed through narrative. But even within that framework, the consistency remains. The Ark does not become passive in the hands of others. It continues to be associated with consequences, reinforcing the idea that it cannot be treated as an ordinary object. From a broader perspective, what we begin to see is that the Ark operates at the intersection of belief, perception, and narrative structure. It is placed in moments where meaning is heightened, where outcomes are significant, and where experiences are intense. Over time, these associations reinforce each other, creating a feedback loop. The more the Ark is linked to extraordinary events, the more it is seen as central to those events. And the more central it becomes, the more carefully it is described, protected, and remembered. This does not diminish the importance of the Ark within its original context. If anything, it highlights how deeply integrated it was into the worldview of those who preserved its story. It was not just an object that existed alongside events. It was part of how those events were understood. It provided a focal point for interpreting what was happening, for connecting actions on the ground with meanings that extended beyond immediate experience. And perhaps this is where the calm, careful approach brings us in this part. Instead of asking whether the Ark caused the events associated with it in a direct physical sense, we can ask how its presence shaped the way those events were experienced, interpreted, and remembered. Did it serve as a kind of anchor for collective attention, a point around which meaning could gather and intensify? Did it help transform ordinary moments into significant ones by marking them as connected to something greater? And if so, does that help explain why its role in these stories feels so consistent, so deliberate, and so difficult to separate from the outcomes themselves? As we sit with these questions, the Ark becomes less of a puzzle to be solved and more of a pattern to be understood. It appears at moments of change. It is surrounded by strict control. It is associated with both protection and danger, and it is remembered as central to events that shaped an entire people's identity. Whether one views those events through a theological lens, a historical lens, or a combination of both, the structure remains the same. And that structure, quiet and consistent, may be one of the most important clues we have. Because sometimes, what matters most is not a single detail, but the way all the details align. And in the case of the Ark of the Covenant, they align in a way that continues to invite careful attention. Not to reach a final answer, but to better understand the depth of the question itself. As we continue deeper into this quiet examination, it becomes useful to slow down even further and focus on something that often sits just beneath the surface of the ark's story, something less obvious than its disappearance or its dramatic appearances, but just as important to understanding why it continues to feel so unusual. That is the relationship between the ark and authority, how it is used to establish legitimacy, reinforce leadership, and define who has the right to act, to speak, and to lead. Because when we look closely, the ark is not only a religious object, it is also closely tied to power, not in a modern political sense, but in the deeper, older sense of who is recognized as being aligned with the divine order. In the mainstream understanding, this connection is entirely expected. In ancient societies, religion and leadership were not separate domains. Kings, priests, and prophets all operated within a framework where authority was understood as coming from a higher source. The ark, as the central symbol of the covenant, naturally becomes part of that framework. It is present when leaders are affirmed, when decisions are made, and when the direction of the community is established. When Moses receives the law, the ark becomes its container. When Joshua leads the people into a new land, the ark goes before them. When kings later establish their rule, the ark is brought into the center of national life. In this sense, the ark is not just a symbol of belief, but a marker of legitimacy. To be aligned with the ark is, in the narrative, to be aligned with the covenant itself. But as we look more closely, we begin to notice that this relationship is not entirely simple or stable. The ark does not automatically guarantee success or approval. There are moments where it is present, yet things do not go as expected. There are times when leaders attempt to use it in ways that do not align with the established structure, and the results are not favorable. This introduces a subtle tension. The ark is associated with authority, but it does not function as a tool that can be controlled or used at will. It remains, in a sense, independent of human intention, even while being central to human systems. One of the clearest examples of this tension appears in the story, where the ark is brought into battle with the expectation that it will ensure victory. From a surface perspective, this might seem logical. If the ark represents divine presence, then bringing it into a conflict might be seen as bringing that presence directly into the situation. But the outcome does not follow that expectation. The ark is captured, and the anticipated victory does not occur. In the mainstream interpretation, this serves as a corrective moment, reinforcing the idea that the ark is not a magical object that guarantees success, but a sacred symbol that must be approached with proper understanding and alignment. It emphasizes that authority comes from adherence to the covenant, not from possession of the object itself. From a broader perspective, this moment is particularly interesting because it reveals something about how objects can be misunderstood within the systems that surround them. Even within the narrative, there is a recognition that the ark could be misinterpreted as a source of automatic power, rather than as a symbol embedded within a larger framework of meaning. And when that misinterpretation occurs, the results challenge it directly. This pattern, where an object associated with power resists being reduced to a simple tool, appears in many historical and cultural contexts. It reflects an awareness that symbols of authority must remain connected to the principles they represent, or they lose their intended function. As we sit with this idea, another layer begins to emerge, one that connects back to the ark's careful handling and restricted access. If the ark is tied to authority, and authority is tied to structure, then controlling access to the ark becomes a way of controlling how authority is expressed and maintained. Only certain individuals can approach it. Only specific rituals allow interaction with it. The closer one gets, the more defined the boundaries become. In the mainstream view, this is about preserving holiness and order, but it also has the effect of reinforcing a system where authority is mediated through designated roles. The Ark is not accessible to everyone, and that limitation shapes how it functions within the al-Mujtama. This does not mean that the system is purely about control in a negative sense. It also creates stability. It ensures that interactions with the most sacred element are not chaotic or unpredictable. It provides a framework within which meaning can be preserved and transmitted. But at the same time, it highlights how closely the Ark is tied to the structure of the society that surrounds it. It is not just an isolated object of reverence. It is integrated into a network of roles, rules, and relationships that define how the community understands itself. There is also a quieter question that begins to take shape here, one that does not have a simple answer, but is worth considering. If the Ark is so central to authority, what happens when it is no longer present? How does a system that has been organized around a single focal point adapt when that point is removed? We touched on this earlier when discussing the Ark's disappearance, but from the perspective of authority, the impact becomes even more significant. Without the Ark, the direct physical symbol of the covenant is gone. The structure remains, but its center has shifted from something tangible to something more abstract. In the history of religious development, this kind of shift is not uncommon. When central objects or locations are lost, traditions often evolve to place greater emphasis on texts, teachings, and practices that can be preserved and carried forward without reliance on a single physical artifact. In this way, the absence of the Ark may have contributed to a transformation in how authority and connection to the divine were understood. The focus moves from a specific object in a specific place to a broader, more distributed system of meaning. And while that transition can be seen as a response to loss, it can also be seen as a form of adaptation, a way of ensuring continuity even when key elements are no longer available. At the same time, the memory of the Ark does not disappear. It continues to exist as a reference point, a reminder of an earlier structure where presence, authority, and object were more closely aligned. And that memory carries with it a certain weight, a sense that something once existed that is no longer directly accessible. This contributes to the ongoing fascination, not just with where the Ark might be, but with what it represented at a time when the connection between symbol and structure felt more immediate. If we take a step back and look at the pattern that has been forming across these parts, we begin to see how the Ark operates across multiple layers at once. It is a physical object, carefully constructed and described. It is a symbolic center, representing covenant and presence. It is part of a system, integrated into rituals, spaces, and roles. And it is connected to authority, shaping how leadership and legitimacy are understood. Each of these layers reinforces the others, creating a kind of coherence that makes the Ark feel both grounded and extraordinary at the same time. And perhaps this is where the deeper curiosity begins to settle in. Not as a desire to uncover a hidden mechanism or a lost secret in the dramatic sense, but as a recognition that the Ark sits at a point where many different aspects of human experience converge. Belief, structure, perception, authority, memory, they all intersect here. And when something occupies that kind of position, it naturally leaves a strong imprint, one that persists even when the object itself is no longer present. So as we let this part come to rest, the question is not simply what the Ark was or where it went, but how it functioned within the world that created it, and how that function continues to echo long after its physical presence has faded. Because sometimes, the most enduring mysteries are not those that hide their answers completely, but those that reveal just enough to keep us looking, quietly, carefully, and without rushing to close the space they leave behind. As we continue, it becomes useful to turn our attention towards something even quieter, something that does not immediately stand out when reading the accounts, but begins to emerge when you step back and look at how the ark is described over time. That is the way memory itself shapes the ark's story. Not just what is said about it, but how it is said, how it is preserved, and how certain details remain consistent while others fade or shift. Because when we are dealing with something that sits at the boundary between history and tradition, memory is not just a passive record. It is an active process, shaping what is remembered, what is emphasized, and what is left uncertain. In the mainstream understanding, the texts that describe the ark were written and compiled over long periods, drawing from earlier traditions, oral accounts, and evolving theological perspectives. This is not unusual for ancient literature. Stories are told, retold, preserved, and shaped in ways that reflect both the original events and the needs of the communities that carry them forward. In this sense, the ark we encounter in the text is not just a snapshot from a single moment in time, but a layered memory, shaped by generations of transmission. The core elements remain stable: the construction, the sacred role, the association with covenant, but the way those elements are framed can reflect changing contexts. This becomes particularly interesting when we consider how consistent certain patterns are, despite the passage of time. The ark is always treated as central. It is always surrounded by restrictions. It is always associated with both reverence and danger. These patterns do not weaken as the story is retold. If anything, they become more defined. And that consistency suggests that whatever the ark represented, it held a stable position in the collective memory of those who preserved its story. It was not a minor detail that could be altered or forgotten. It was something that had to be carried forward with care. At the same time, there are areas where the memory becomes less precise. Details about the ark's later history become sparse. Its final location is not clearly recorded. The transition from presence to absence is not fully explained. This combination, strong consistency in some areas and silence in others, is one of the most intriguing aspects of the ark's narrative. It suggests that the memory was carefully maintained up to a point, and then, for reasons we do not fully understand, it becomes less detailed. Not necessarily lost all at once, but gradually less anchored to specific information. From a historical perspective, this can happen for many reasons. Records may be destroyed. Traditions may shift focus. Communities may prioritize certain aspects of a story over others. But from a more reflective standpoint, it raises a subtle question. When something is remembered with such clarity in one phase, and then becomes uncertain in another, what does that tell us about the conditions under which it was preserved? Was the ark's early history recorded in a context where its presence was immediate and tangible, while its later history unfolded during a time of disruption and loss? And if so, does that help explain why the narrative feels so grounded at first, and then gradually more open-ended? There is also the role of oral tradition to consider. Before texts were written and compiled, stories were passed down through spoken word, through repetition, through structured memory. In such systems, certain elements are preserved with remarkable accuracy, especially those that are central to identity or practice. At the same time, peripheral details can change, adapt, or fade depending on how they are transmitted. If the ark was indeed a central object in early Israelite life, its core characteristics would have been reinforced through repeated telling, through ritual, through shared experience. But once it was no longer physically present, the way it was remembered may have shifted. The focus may have moved from direct interaction to reflection, from observation to interpretation. This transition, from lived experience to remembered experience, is subtle, but important. When people interact with something directly, their understanding is shaped by immediate context. When they remember it later, especially across generations, that understanding is shaped by narrative, by explanation, by the need to preserve meaning, even when direct access is gone. And in that process, the object can take on a slightly different role. It becomes less about what it is in a physical sense, and more about what it represents within the story that continues to be told. This may help explain why the ark feels both concrete and elusive at the same time. The early descriptions give us a sense of structure, detail, and presence. But the later silence leaves room for interpretation. And within that space, the ark becomes something that can be approached from multiple angles: historical, theological, symbolic, without being fully contained by any one of them. Another aspect of memory that is worth considering is how it interacts with loss. When something important is lost, the way it is remembered can change. Sometimes the memory becomes sharper, more defined, as people try to preserve what is no longer accessible. Other times, it becomes more diffuse, blending with interpretation and meaning. In the case of the ark, we seem to see both tendencies at once. The early details remain clear and structured, while the later trajectory becomes less certain. It is as though the beginning is anchored, while the ending remains open. This open-ended quality is part of what keeps the ark's story active. If its fate were clearly recorded, if there were a definitive account of what happened, much of the ongoing curiosity might fade. But because the record leaves space, because it does not fully resolve the question, the story continues to invite attention. Not in a way that demands speculation, but in a way that allows for continued reflection. And this brings us back to the calm, careful approach that has guided us so far. The goal is not to fill the gaps with assumptions, but to understand the shape of the gaps themselves. What is known, what is repeated, what is left unsaid, and how those elements interact. Because sometimes the absence of information is not just a limitation. It is part of the structure of the story, shaping how it is experienced and remembered. As we sit with this, the ark begins to feel less like a single mystery waiting to be solved, and more like a layered narrative that reflects the way human beings engage with the past. We preserve what matters, we interpret what we inherit, and we continue to ask questions where the record remains open. The Ark of the Covenant, in this sense, is not only an object of ancient significance, but a reflection of how memory itself works, how it holds on, how it shifts, and how it leaves just enough space for curiosity to remain. And perhaps that is why, even now, it continues to draw attention. Not because it offers clear answers, but because it invites careful thought. It encourages us to look at what is present, to notice what is absent, and to consider how both contribute to the story we are still trying to understand. As we continue, it becomes helpful to turn our attention toward another layer of this mystery, one that sits quietly beneath the historical and narrative details, and that is the question of perception. How the Ark may have been experienced by those who encountered it, and how those experiences shaped the way it was described. Because while we have looked at structure, authority, and memory, there is still the question of what it actually felt like to be near something considered so intensely sacred, so carefully restricted, and so consistently associated with both reverence and danger. In the mainstream understanding, the experience of the Ark is framed entirely in theological terms. To approach it is to approach the presence of God, and that experience is understood as overwhelming, not because of any physical property of the object itself, but because of what it represents. The language used in the texts reflects this. There is a sense of awe, of fear, of boundaries that must not be crossed lightly. The reactions are not casual. They are immediate, serious, and often described in ways that emphasize the weight of the moment. This is consistent with many religious traditions, where encounters with the sacred are described as intense, transformative, and sometimes even dangerous if approached without preparation. But if we step back slightly, without challenging that interpretation, we can also consider how human perception works in situations like this. When individuals are placed in highly structured environments, surrounded by ritual, expectation, and shared belief, their experiences can become amplified. The combination of sensory elements, sound, movement, restricted space, controlled access, and focused attention can create a state where ordinary perception feels heightened. This does not require anything supernatural in a literal sense. It is a well-documented aspect of human psychology. Under the right conditions, experiences can feel more vivid, more significant, and more charged with meaning than they would in a neutral setting. Now, when we apply this to the Ark, something interesting begins to emerge. The environment surrounding the Ark is designed to be highly controlled. Access is limited. Movements are deliberate. Rituals are precise. The use of incense alters the atmosphere. The garments, the lighting, the spatial separation, all of these elements contribute to an experience that is far from ordinary. And when individuals enter that environment, especially with the understanding that they are approaching something of ultimate importance, their perception is likely to reflect that intensity. This does not reduce the experience to something purely psychological. It simply acknowledges that human perception plays a role in how events are experienced and remembered. If someone enters a space where every element signals importance, danger, and sacredness, their response will naturally align with those signals. The experience will feel significant because everything about the environment reinforces that significance. This perspective also helps us understand why the Ark is described with such consistent seriousness. It is not just that the object itself is important. It is that every interaction with it is framed in a way that reinforces its importance. Over time, this creates a feedback loop. The more intense the experience, the more carefully it is remembered. The more carefully it is remembered, the more structured the rituals become. And the more structured the rituals become, the more intense the experience feels for those who participate. There is also the element of expectation. When people believe they are approaching something powerful, their perception is shaped by that belief. This can influence how they interpret what happens in that moment. If something unexpected occurs, a sudden noise, a shift in light, a physical reaction, it may be understood within the framework of that expectation. Again, this does not mean the experience is imagined. It means that interpretation and perception are closely linked, especially in environments where meaning is already highly concentrated. Another detail that becomes more interesting in this context is the emphasis on preparation. Before approaching the Ark, individuals are required to follow specific steps, to wear certain garments, to perform certain actions. In the mainstream view, this is about ritual purity and obedience, but from a perceptual standpoint, preparation also serves to focus attention. It creates a transition from ordinary activity into a different state of awareness. By the time the individual reaches the point of interaction, they are already primed to experience the moment as significant. This pattern, preparation, restricted access, controlled environment, heightened expectation, is not unique to the Ark. It appears in many contexts where experiences are designed to be meaningful, whether in religious, cultural, or even modern settings. But in the case of the Ark, the intensity of these elements is particularly strong. And that intensity may contribute to why the descriptions feel so consistent and so charged, even when viewed from a distance. As we sit with this, a quieter understanding begins to take shape. The Ark may not need to be explained as something beyond the framework of its time in order to feel extraordinary. The combination of its role, its environment, and the way it was experienced may be enough to account for much of what we observe in the narrative. It is an object placed within a system that amplifies its significance at every level: structural, social, and perceptual. At the same time, this does not close the question. It simply reframes it. Instead of asking what hidden property the ark might have had, we can ask how the interaction between object, environment, and human perception created an experience that was remembered as powerful, meaningful, and sometimes dangerous. And once we begin to look at it this way, the consistency of the descriptions becomes less surprising. It reflects not just what the ark was, but how it was encountered. There is also something else to notice here, something subtle but important. When experiences are shaped by such strong frameworks, they tend to leave lasting impressions. They are remembered, retold, and preserved with care. And over time, those memories become part of a larger narrative, one that extends beyond the original context. The ark, in this sense, is not just an object that was experienced in a particular way. It is an object whose associated experiences were powerful enough to be carried forward across generations, shaping how it is understood even now. So as we let this part settle, the focus shifts slightly. The ark is still central, but now we are looking at it through the lens of experience. Not just what it was or where it went, but how it was encountered, and how those encounters shaped the story that has come down to us. Because sometimes the key to understanding a mystery is not found in the object itself, but in the way it was perceived by those who stood near it, carefully, quietly, and with the sense that they were approaching something that could not be treated as ordinary. As we continue, it becomes useful to step even further back, to look not just at the ark itself or the people who interacted with it, but at the broader world in which it existed. Because sometimes a mystery becomes clearer when placed alongside other things that, at first glance, seem unrelated. The Ark of the Covenant did not exist in isolation within history. It emerged within a wider landscape of ancient cultures, each with their own sacred objects, rituals, and ways of representing the divine. And by comparing these patterns carefully, not to reduce the ark to something ordinary, but to better understand its context, we begin to notice both similarities and differences that sharpen the question rather than diminish it. In the mainstream historical view, ancient societies across the Near East often created physical objects that served as focal points for divine presence. These could be statues, sacred chests, or portable shrines, sometimes carried into battle, sometimes housed in temples, and often associated with specific rituals and restrictions. In Egypt, Mesopotamia, and surrounding regions, there are records of processions where sacred objects were transported with great care, accompanied by priests, music, and ceremonial actions. In this sense, the idea of a sacred object being central to religious life is not unusual. The Ark fits within a recognizable pattern of how ancient people interacted with the concept of the divine, through objects that were treated as more than symbolic, as points where the unseen could be approached in a controlled way. But when we look more closely, the Ark also stands apart in several key ways. Unlike many other sacred objects, it is not described as an image or representation of a deity. There is no statue inside it. Instead, it contains the tablets of the covenant, emphasizing law, agreement, and relationship, rather than visual depiction. This is significant because it reflects a different approach to the divine, one that resists physical representation and instead focuses on presence without form. In a world where many cultures created visible images of their gods, the Ark represents something more abstract, yet it is treated with equal or greater intensity. That contrast alone is worth noticing, because it suggests that while the Ark shares structural similarities with other sacred objects, its meaning is shaped by a distinct theological framework. There is also the question of portability. While other cultures had movable sacred items, the Ark's role as a traveling center of presence is particularly emphasized. It moves with the people, not just as a symbol, but as a constant point of reference. This reinforces the idea that the divine is not confined to a single location, but accompanies the community through changing circumstances. In the mainstream interpretation, this is a defining feature of early Israelite belief. But from a broader perspective, it also creates a unique dynamic. A fixed temple can be approached and left behind. A moving focal point changes how space is experienced, turning the journey itself into something structured around the presence of the sacred. Now, when we place the Ark alongside these broader patterns, something subtle begins to emerge. It is both familiar and distinct. It shares the idea of a sacred object at the center of ritual life, but it expresses that idea in a way that is less about representation and more about relationship, less about display and more about controlled interaction. And this balance between the recognizable and the unique may be part of what makes the Ark so difficult to fully categorize. It does not fit neatly into a single model. It overlaps with others, but it also diverges in important ways. This is where alternative interpretations sometimes take hold, not because they are necessarily supported by strong evidence, but because the Ark's distinctiveness invites further questioning. If it is similar to other objects, why is it treated with such specific intensity? If it is different, what accounts for that difference? Some have suggested that the Ark's uniqueness reflects a deeper or earlier tradition that has not been fully preserved. Others have proposed that its role evolved over time, becoming more defined as the surrounding belief system developed. And still others have wondered whether the descriptions preserve fragments of something that was once understood more directly, but later reframed in symbolic terms. Again, the careful approach is to recognize these ideas as questions rather than conclusions. The available evidence does not allow us to definitively resolve them, but the questions themselves are meaningful because they arise from observable patterns. When something stands both within and apart from its context, it naturally invites closer attention. Another aspect to consider is how the Ark compares not just to physical objects, but to concepts. In many traditions, there are ideas of sacred presence that do not rely on a specific object, but are associated with places, moments, or experiences. The Ark, in some ways, seems to bridge these categories. It is a physical object, yet it is also treated as the seat of something that cannot be contained in physical form. This dual role, material and immaterial, adds to its complexity. It is both there and not there, both defined and beyond definition. From a narrative standpoint, this allows the Ark to function in multiple ways at once. It can be carried, placed, and described, but it can also represent something that extends beyond those physical actions. And this flexibility may be part of why it remains so central in the story, even when its physical presence is no longer part of the historical record. The idea it represents continues to operate, even in the absence of the object itself. As we reflect on all of this, a clearer picture begins to form, not of a solution, but of a pattern. The Ark exists at the intersection of several lines: historical practice, theological meaning, cultural context, and human perception. It shares features with other sacred objects, but it also diverges in ways that make it stand out. It is described with precision, yet it disappears without resolution. It is central to a system, yet it transcends that system in how it is remembered. And perhaps this is where the deeper curiosity lies, not in trying to force the Ark into a single category, but in recognizing that it resists that kind of simplification. It asks to be looked at from multiple angles, each revealing part of the picture, but none providing a complete view on their own. The more carefully we compare, the more we see both the connections and the differences, and the more the mystery becomes one of understanding how all these elements fit together. So as we let this part settle, the Ark becomes something slightly different in our view. Not just an isolated object with an unknown fate, but a point of convergence within a larger world of ideas and practices. And by placing it within that world, without losing sight of its uniqueness, we move a little closer to understanding why it continues to feel both familiar and unresolved at the same time. As we continue, it becomes necessary to slow down again and focus on something that often goes unnoticed precisely because it feels so familiar. And that is the way the Ark is described in terms of measurement, design, and physical structure. Up to this point, we have explored its role, its environment, its disappearance, and its place within a wider cultural landscape. But there is another layer, quieter and more grounded, that deserves careful attention. The simple fact that the Ark is described as a constructed object, built to exact specifications, with dimensions that are not vague or symbolic, but precise. In the mainstream understanding, this precision reflects the importance of obedience to divine instruction. The measurements, the materials, the design elements, all of these are given to Moses as part of a larger set of instructions for constructing the tabernacle and its contents. The Ark is not improvised. It is made according to a pattern. This is consistent with many ancient traditions, where sacred architecture and objects are created with careful attention to proportion and detail, often reflecting deeper symbolic meanings. Numbers, dimensions, and materials can carry significance, representing order, harmony, and alignment with a higher principle. So in this view, the Ark's design is not just practical, but also symbolic, expressing the idea that the sacred is structured, intentional, and precise. But when we look at these descriptions more closely, another question begins to emerge, one that does not challenge the symbolic meaning, but adds another layer to it. Why such emphasis on exact construction for an object that, in essence, serves as a container? Why the specific combination of materials, the layering of wood and gold, the defined proportions, the integrated carrying system? In many cases, sacred objects are described in general terms, emphasizing their significance rather than their exact dimensions. But here, the detail is consistent and deliberate, as if the physical form itself matters in a very specific way. One possible explanation, fully within the mainstream perspective, is that the Ark's design reflects a broader pattern of sacred craftsmanship. In ancient contexts, creating something for ritual use was not just about function, but about alignment with a perceived order of the world. Precision was a way of honoring that order. To build something exactly as instructed was to participate in that structure, to bring the physical object into harmony with the meaning it was meant to carry. In this sense, the Ark's measurements are not arbitrary. They are part of what makes it appropriate for its role. At the same time, the physical design also has practical implications. The use of acacia wood provides strength and durability. The gold overlay protects and preserves. The rings and poles allow it to be carried without direct contact. Each element serves a function, even as it carries symbolic weight. And when we consider these functions together, the Ark begins to look less like a simple container and more like a carefully engineered object, designed to be both portable and protected, accessible yet restricted. This is where a quieter form of speculation sometimes begins. Not the dramatic kind, but the kind that asks whether the design might reflect more than symbolic intention. Could the specific combination of materials and structure have had effects that were noticed, even if not fully understood? For example, metal over wood creates a layered construction that can interact with environmental conditions in particular ways. Gold, as we mentioned earlier, is not only valuable, but also has physical properties that distinguish it from other materials. None of this suggests advanced technology or hidden mechanisms, but it does raise the possibility that the Ark's design was informed, at least in part, by observation. by what worked, what endured, and what produced noticeable effects. If we remain grounded, this idea becomes less about mystery and more about craftsmanship. Ancient builders were highly skilled. They understood materials through experience, even if they did not describe them in modern scientific terms. They knew how to construct objects that were durable, stable, and suited to their intended use. So the ark's precision may reflect a level of expertise that is sometimes underestimated, rather than something entirely unknown. There is also the matter of proportion. The ark's dimensions are not extreme. It is not enormous, nor is it particularly small. It is sized in a way that allows it to be carried by a group of individuals, suggesting that its design was closely tied to its intended use in movement. This reinforces the idea that its construction was practical as well as symbolic. It had to function within the real conditions of travel, transport, and placement within the tabernacle. And when something is designed to move through different environments, its structure becomes even more important. Another detail that becomes more interesting over time is the lid of the ark, often referred to as the mercy seat, with the two cherubim facing each other. In the mainstream interpretation, this is a deeply symbolic element, representing the place where divine presence is understood to dwell between the figures. It is not the ark as a whole, but this specific point that is emphasized as the meeting place. This focus on a particular location within the object adds another layer of precision. It is not just the ark in general, but a defined area that carries the highest significance. From a structural perspective, this creates a kind of focal point, a place where attention is directed, where interaction is centered. And once again, we see the pattern repeating. The ark is not only constructed with care, but its design guides how it is experienced. It directs where one looks, where one approaches, and where meaning is concentrated. As we bring these observations together, the ark begins to appear less like an abstract symbol and more like a carefully designed object operating within a structured system. Its materials, its dimensions, its components, and its method of transport all align with its role. And while this does not resolve the larger mystery, it does ground it. It reminds us that whatever the ark represented, it was also something that had to exist in the physical world, subject to the realities of construction, movement, and use. And perhaps this is where the deeper reflection begins in this part. When we think about mysteries, there is often a tendency to look beyond the physical, to imagine hidden aspects that lie outside ordinary explanation. But sometimes, the physical details themselves are where the most interesting questions begin, not because they reveal something extraordinary in a dramatic sense, but because they show how carefully something was made, how deliberately it was designed, and how closely its form was tied to its function. The Ark of the Covenant, in this light, is not just a missing object surrounded by speculation. It is also a piece of craftsmanship, a constructed reality that once existed within a specific context. And by paying attention to that reality, to its measurements, its materials, its structure, we move closer to understanding it as something that was both meaningful and tangible at the same time. So as we let this part settle, the focus shifts once again, not to where the ark is or what it might secretly be, but to how it was made and what that tells us about the people who built it, the system they placed it within, and the level of care they invested in something they believed was central to their understanding of the world. Because sometimes the quiet details, the ones that seem the most straightforward, are the ones that stay with us the longest, inviting us to look again, just a little more closely. As we continue, it becomes useful to gently shift our attention towards something that sits at the edge of both history and interpretation, something that is rarely stated directly, but quietly shapes how the ark is understood across time. And that is the idea of absence not as an ending but as a presence of its own. Because by now, we have explored what the ark was described to be, how it was used, how it was experienced, and how it may have disappeared. But what happens after that disappearance is just as important as what came before it. The ark does not simply vanish and become irrelevant. Instead, it begins to occupy a different kind of space, one that is not physical, but conceptual, almost like a quiet outline that remains even when the object itself is no longer there. In the mainstream understanding, this transition is part of a broader shift in religious life. After the destruction of the first temple and the loss of central objects like the ark, the focus of worship and identity gradually moves toward practices that do not rely on a single physical location or artifact. Texts, teachings, and communal rituals take on a greater role, allowing continuity even in the absence of what once stood at the center. This is a pattern seen in many traditions. When something central is lost, the system adapts, finding new ways to preserve meaning. And in that sense, the ark's disappearance becomes part of a larger historical process, one that reflects resilience rather than simply loss. But even within that adaptation, the ark continues to hold a quiet influence. It is remembered, it is referenced, it is not replaced in a direct sense, but it remains in the background as a kind of origin point, something that once defined the structure and still shapes how that structure is understood. And this is where the idea of absence becomes interesting. The ark is no longer present, yet it continues to act as a reference for what presence once meant. It becomes a standard against which later forms are measured, even if those forms no longer include it. From a reflective perspective, this creates a unique kind of tension. There is a memory of something that was once tangible, something that could be approached, carried, and described in detail. But that memory now exists without direct access. And when something is remembered in that way, clearly described, deeply significant, but physically unavailable, it tends to take on a different quality. It becomes something that invites contemplation rather than interaction, something that exists more in thought than in space. This may help explain why the ark continues to appear in later traditions, stories, and interpretations, even when its physical presence is no longer part of the lived reality. It is not just that people are trying to locate it. It is that the idea of it continues to hold meaning. It represents a point in time when the connection between object, presence, and experience felt immediate and defined. And even as that connection shifts, the memory of it remains. There is also something else that begins to emerge when we consider absence in this way. When an object is present, it can be examined, understood within limits, and eventually placed within a framework of knowledge. But when it is absent, especially when that absence is unresolved, it remains open. It cannot be fully categorized or concluded. It resists closure. And that openness allows it to continue evolving within thought, taking on new interpretations, while still anchored to its original descriptions. This is not unique to the ark, but the ark is a particularly clear example of it. Many historical objects have been lost, but not all of them continue to generate the same level of attention. What makes the ark different is the combination of its detailed description, its central importance, and the lack of a clear conclusion. That combination creates a space where curiosity remains active, not because of sensational claims, but because the structure of the story itself leaves room for it. At the same time, there is a balance that needs to be maintained. It is easy to let absence become a canvas for speculation, to fill the unknown with ideas that extend far beyond what the evidence supports. But the more careful approach is to recognize that absence does not necessarily imply hidden complexity. Sometimes it simply reflects the limits of what has been preserved. And yet, even within those limits, the way absence interacts with memory and meaning can still be deeply interesting. If we bring this back to the ark, we begin to see that its disappearance does not reduce its significance. In some ways, it transforms it. The ark moves from being a physical center within a specific system to being a conceptual center within a broader narrative. It becomes something that can be approached through study, reflection, and interpretation, rather than direct interaction. And that shift changes how it is experienced, not just by those who first encountered it, but by everyone who has considered it since. There is also a quieter question that lingers here, one that does not demand an answer, but is worth holding in mind. If the Ark had not disappeared, if it had remained visible, preserved, and accessible, would it carry the same sense of mystery? Would it still invite the same level of careful thought? Or would it have become something more defined, more contained within the boundaries of what can be known? It is difficult to say, but the fact that it is not present, that it exists within this space of partial knowledge, is part of what gives it its enduring quality. And so, as we let this part settle, the focus shifts once more. The Ark is no longer just an object of the past. It is also an example of how the past continues to live within the present, not through direct evidence alone, but through the interplay of memory, absence, and meaning. It reminds us that not everything of importance remains available to be examined, and that sometimes what is missing can be just as influential as what remains. Because in the end, the Ark of the Covenant is not only a question of what once existed, but a reflection of how we engage with what is no longer there. And the more carefully we consider that, the more we begin to understand that the mystery is not just about the object itself, but about the space it leaves behind, and how that space continues to shape the way we think, quietly and without resolution. As we continue, it becomes useful to turn our attention toward another dimension of this mystery, one that sits somewhere between the physical and the symbolic, and that is the idea of sound, rhythm, and repetition in relation to the Ark. This is something that is not always immediately obvious, but when you begin to notice it, it appears with a kind of quiet consistency. The Ark is rarely described in isolation during key events. It is often accompanied by movement, by coordinated action, and sometimes by sound, trumpets, marching, voices, structured sequences that unfold over time. And while these details are often read as part of ritual or ceremony, they may also offer insight into how the Ark was experienced within those moments. In the mainstream understanding, these elements are part of religious practice. Rituals often involve repetition, coordinated movement, and sound because these create structure and meaning. When the Israelites march around Jericho, for example, the pattern is precise. There is a sequence of days, a number of circuits, a final moment where sound breaks the silence. The Ark is present throughout, carried as the central object within that structured action. From a theological perspective, the emphasis is not on the mechanics of the ritual, but on obedience and alignment with divine instruction. The sound, the movement, the repetition, these are expressions of that alignment. But when we look at this pattern from a slightly different angle, something else begins to emerge. Repetition and rhythm have a powerful effect on human perception. When actions are repeated in a structured way, especially in a group setting, they can create a sense of anticipation, focus, and heightened awareness. Sound, in particular, can shape how space is experienced. It can build tension, mark transitions, and create a shared sense of timing. These are not modern discoveries. They are aspects of human experience that have been understood, at least intuitively, across cultures and throughout history. So when we see the Ark consistently placed within these structured sequences, it raises an interesting possibility. The Ark is not only present during significant events, it is present within environments that are designed to intensify perception. The rhythm of movement, the coordination of participants, the use of sound, all of these elements contribute to an experience that feels organized, deliberate, and meaningful. And within that experience, the Ark becomes the focal point, the center around which everything else is arranged. This does not suggest that the Ark itself is producing these effects. Rather, It suggests that the way it is integrated into these events amplifies its significance. The more structured the environment, the more clearly the arc stands out as the central element. And over time, this repeated association between the arc and moments of heightened experience may reinforce the sense that it is connected to those moments in a deeper way. There is also the element of timing. Many of the events involving the arc are not instantaneous. They unfold over a sequence, whether it is days of marching, carefully timed rituals, or specific moments of action. This introduces a temporal dimension to the experience. It is not just about where the arc is, but when it is present, and how its presence aligns with particular points in a sequence. Timing, like structure and sound, can shape perception. It creates expectation, builds toward a moment, and then releases that tension in a way that feels significant. If we consider all of this together, movement, sound, repetition, timing, we begin to see that the arc is consistently placed within environments that are designed to focus attention. And when attention is focused in that way, experiences can feel more intense, more meaningful, and more memorable. This does not require any extraordinary explanation. It is simply how human perception responds to structured environments. At the same time, this observation adds another layer to our understanding of the arc's role. It is not just an object that appears in important moments. It is an object that is embedded within carefully constructed experiences. And those experiences are designed, whether consciously or intuitively, to highlight its importance. Over time, this creates a strong association between the arc and the outcomes of those events, even if the arc itself is not acting in a direct physical sense. There is also something to be said about collective experience. When large groups of people participate in coordinated actions, especially those involving rhythm and sound, the experience is shared. It is not isolated to individuals. It becomes something that is felt across the group, creating a sense of unity and common purpose. In such moments, the central object, whatever it may be, takes on an even greater significance because it serves as the focal point for that shared experience. In the case of the arc, this may have contributed to how strongly it was remembered and how deeply it was integrated into the identity of the community. This perspective does not replace the mainstream interpretation. It sits alongside it, offering another way to understand how the arc's presence may have been experienced. The theological meaning remains central, but the way that meaning is expressed through structured action, sound, and repetition adds depth to the picture. It shows how physical experience and symbolic meaning can work together, each reinforcing the other. As we let this settle, another quiet realization begins to take shape. The arc's significance is not only found in what it is or where it is, but in how it is encountered within moments that are carefully shaped to be remembered. It is placed at the center of experiences that are designed to leave an impression, to mark transitions, to define events as meaningful. And because of that, it becomes inseparable from those events in the way they are later described and understood. So, once again, the mystery does not narrow, it deepens. Not by introducing something entirely new, but by revealing another layer of how the arc fits into the patterns we have been observing. It is part of a system, part of a narrative, part of a series of experiences that are structured in ways that amplify its presence. And the more we notice these patterns, the more we begin to understand that the arc's enduring power may come not from a single hidden property, but from the way it was woven into so many aspects of life, perception, and memory at once. And as we continue forward, we carry that awareness with us, allowing each new detail to connect with what we have already seen, building not toward a final answer, but toward a clearer sense of how all these pieces come together, quietly, steadily, and without forcing them into something they are not. As we continue, it becomes useful to slow things down once more and turn our attention towards something that sits at the intersection of all the layers we have explored so far. And that is the idea of boundaries. Not just physical boundaries like walls or veils, but conceptual boundaries. Those invisible lines that define what is permitted, what is restricted, what is known, and what remains just out of reach. Because when you look closely, the Ark of the Covenant is always positioned at a boundary. It is never fully within ordinary space and never entirely outside of it. It exists in between, at the edge of access, at the point where approach becomes hesitation. In the mainstream understanding, this is central to its meaning. The Ark represents divine presence, and that presence is not something that can be approached without structure. The boundaries around it are there to maintain order, to preserve holiness, and to prevent what is considered a dangerous kind of closeness. The veil of the Holy of Holies, the restrictions on who may approach, the specific times and conditions required, all of these are expressions of a system that defines where the line is drawn. And that line is not arbitrary, it is what separates the ordinary from the sacred. But if we look at this pattern more closely, something else begins to emerge. The Ark does not eliminate the boundary, it defines it. It gives it a location, a form, a center. Without the Ark, the boundary becomes more abstract, less anchored. But with the Ark present, the boundary becomes tangible. It can be approached, but only to a certain point. It can be described, but not fully crossed. And this creates a unique kind of relationship between people and the space around it. The Ark is not just an object within the boundary. It is the reason the boundary exists in the way it does. This becomes particularly interesting when we consider how boundaries function in human experience. Boundaries are not only about restriction, they are also about meaning. They define significance by limiting access. When something is completely open, it can become ordinary. But when access is controlled, when there are conditions that must be met, the act of approaching becomes intentional. It requires preparation, attention, and awareness. And in that process, the experience itself becomes more focused. The Ark operates within this dynamic consistently. It is always surrounded by layers, distance, roles, rituals, timing. Each layer reinforces the boundary, but also guides the approach. You can come closer, but only in the right way. You can interact, but only under certain conditions. And in that structure, the Ark becomes the focal point of a carefully managed relationship between presence and distance. There is also a quieter aspect to this, one that is easy to overlook. Boundaries do not just control access from the outside, they also shape what happens inside. When the high priest enters the Holy of Holies, it is not just that others are kept out. It is that the experience inside that space is different, precisely because of that separation. The absence of ordinary activity, the controlled environment, the awareness of crossing into a restricted area, all of these factors combine to create a moment that feels distinct from anything outside it. From a perceptual standpoint, this is significant. When a boundary is clearly defined, crossing it becomes an event. It marks a transition, and transitions are often remembered more vividly than continuous experience. This may help explain why interactions with the Ark are described with such intensity. They are not everyday occurrences. They are moments that stand apart, framed by the boundaries that surround them. Now, if we extend this idea slightly, another question begins to form. If the Ark defines a boundary between the ordinary and the sacred, what happens when that boundary is no longer anchored by a physical object? When the Ark disappears, the boundary does not necessarily vanish, but it becomes less tied to a specific location. It shifts into something more abstract, more distributed across practices, texts, and interpretations. The line is still there, but it is no longer marked by a single focal point. This shift may be one of the most important transformations in the Ark's story. While the object itself is gone, the concept it represented, the idea of a boundary that must be approached with care, continues. It becomes embedded in other forms, shaping how space, ritual, and meaning are understood, even without the Ark's physical presence. And in that sense, the Ark's role evolves. It moves from being the center of a defined boundary to being the origin of a concept that extends beyond it. At the same time, the memory of the original boundary remains. The descriptions of restricted access, of veils and conditions, of consequences for crossing the line improperly, these continue to inform how the Ark is imagined. And because the object itself is no longer present, that memory is not replaced by direct experience. It remains as a kind of imprint, something that can be studied, reflected on, but not revisited in the same way. This creates an interesting balance. The Ark is both defined and undefined. We know where it was placed, how it was approached, how it was treated, but we do not know where it is now, or whether those same boundaries could ever be encountered again in the same form. And within that balance, the sense of mystery persists, not because something is being deliberately hidden, but because the structure that once made the boundary tangible is no longer accessible. There is also a broader pattern here, one that extends beyond the Ark itself. Throughout history, objects and places that define boundaries often carry a lasting significance, even after they are gone. They represent points of transition, of meaning, of connection between different states of experience. And when they are no longer present, the memory of them continues to shape how those transitions are understood. So as we sit with this, the Ark becomes something slightly different once again. Not just an object of construction, or a center of ritual, or a missing artifact, but a marker of a boundary that once had a clear form. It reminds us that meaning is often created at the edges, at the points where access is limited and approach is guided. And it suggests that part of the Ark's enduring presence in thought may come from the way it defined that edge so clearly, leaving behind a structure that can still be sensed, even if it can no longer be physically reached. And perhaps that is where this part gently settles. Not in a conclusion, but in a recognition that the Ark's mystery is not only about what it was or where it went, but about the line it drew, the space it defined, and the way that space continues to exist, quietly, in the way we think about the boundary between what can be approached and what must remain just beyond it. As we continue, it becomes useful to turn our attention toward one of the final layers in this quiet exploration, and that is the way the Ark of the Covenant has continued to live beyond its original setting, not as a physical object, but as an idea that moves through time, reshaping itself as it encounters new contexts, new interpretations, and new questions. Because by now, we have followed the Ark through its construction, its use, its environment, its disappearance, and the patterns that surround it. But what happens after that? How it continues to exist in thought, in tradition, and in imagination, adds another dimension that cannot be ignored. In the mainstream understanding, the Ark remains primarily a sacred object within the context of the Hebrew Bible, a symbol of covenant, presence, and divine law. Its role is anchored in that framework, and its significance is understood through the traditions that preserve it. But as time passes, the Ark does not remain confined to that original context. It begins to appear in later writings, interpretations, and discussions, each adding a layer, each reflecting the concerns and perspectives of a different period. This is not unusual. Important symbols often extend beyond their original setting, taking on new meanings as they are encountered by different cultures and traditions. But the Ark does this in a particularly interesting way. It does not lose its original identity. It is still recognized as the same object described in ancient texts. Yet at the same time, it becomes something that can be approached from multiple angles: historical, theological, philosophical, and even speculative. As we observe this, a pattern begins to emerge. The arc functions almost like a point of convergence for different kinds of questions. For some, it is a matter of faith, a symbol that represents a specific relationship between the divine and humanity. For others, it is a historical question, an artifact that may or may not have existed in the form described, whose fate remains uncertain. And for others still, it becomes a subject of curiosity, a mystery that invites exploration into what might lie beyond the limits of the available record. What is interesting is that these perspectives do not necessarily cancel each other out. They exist alongside one another, sometimes overlapping, sometimes diverging, but all centered on the same object. And this coexistence adds to the arc's complexity. It is not fixed within a single interpretation. It remains open, not in a way that invites unfounded conclusions, but in a way that allows different lines of thought to engage with it from different directions. There is also something to be said about the way the arc appears in modern discussions. It is often brought up in conversations about lost history, ancient mysteries, and the possibility that there are aspects of the past we do not fully understand. In many cases, these discussions move quickly into speculation, sometimes stretching far beyond what the evidence can support. But beneath that, there is a more grounded curiosity, one that reflects a genuine interest in how something so central could become so uncertain. This curiosity is not limited to any one group or perspective. It appears in academic research, in theological reflection, and in broader cultural conversations. And while the conclusions drawn from these discussions can vary widely, the fact that the arc continues to be part of them is itself significant. It suggests that the questions it raises are not easily resolved, and that its story continues to resonate in ways that go beyond its original context. At the same time, it is important to maintain the balance we have carried throughout this exploration. The arc's continued presence in thought does not necessarily imply that it holds hidden secrets waiting to be uncovered. It may simply reflect the combination of factors we have already seen: detailed descriptions, central importance, unresolved disappearance, and the layers of meaning that have accumulated over time. When these elements come together, they create a subject that naturally invites attention. And yet, even with that grounding, there is something about the arc that continues to feel just slightly out of reach. Not in a dramatic sense, but in a quiet, persistent way. It is known, but not fully. Described, but not present. Central, but not accessible. And that combination creates a kind of lasting tension, one that does not demand resolution, but continues to invite careful thought. If we step back and look at the larger picture, we begin to see that the arc's enduring presence is not just about what it was, but about how it functions as a point of reflection. It allows us to consider how history is preserved, how meaning is constructed, how absence shapes memory, and how objects can continue to influence thought long after they are gone. In this sense, the arc becomes more than a subject of inquiry. It becomes a way of exploring how we engage with the past itself, and perhaps this is where this part gently comes to rest. Not with a conclusion, but with a recognition that the arc story does not end with its disappearance. It continues quietly, in the way it is remembered, discussed, and reconsidered across time. It remains a point where different lines of thought meet, where questions remain open, and where the balance between what is known and what is not continues to hold our attention. Because in the end, the Ark of the Covenant is not only a relic of an ancient narrative, it is also a mirror, reflecting the way we think about mystery, about history, and about the spaces in between where certainty fades and careful curiosity begins. As we begin to approach the final stages of this quiet exploration, it becomes useful to gather the threads we have been following and look at them not as separate ideas, but as parts of a single, layered pattern. Because the Ark of the Covenant, when examined carefully, does not present itself as a simple mystery with a single missing answer. Instead, it unfolds as a convergence of multiple elements: historical, structural, perceptual, and conceptual, all interacting in ways that create the sense of depth we have been tracing from the beginning. We started with the physical object, described in detail, constructed with intention, placed at the center of a carefully ordered system. That alone would be enough to make it significant. But then we followed its movement through narrative, noticing how it appears at moments of transition, at points where boundaries are crossed and events take on greater meaning. We looked at the environment surrounding it, the layers of restriction, the structured access, the rituals that define how it is approached. We considered how human perception interacts with such environments, how experience can be shaped by expectation, repetition, and controlled space. And gradually, without forcing any conclusions, a pattern began to form. At the same time, we noticed something equally important: the silence that follows. The arc, so clearly described in one phase, becomes uncertain in another. Its presence gives way to absence, and that absence is never fully resolved. Instead of a clear ending, we are left with possibilities, with traditions, with questions that remain open. And rather than closing the story, that openness becomes part of what keeps it alive. If we look at these elements together, something becomes clear. The arc's mystery is not located in a single detail. It is not hidden in one missing piece of evidence or one overlooked clue. It emerges from the interaction of everything we have seen: the precision of its design, the intensity of its handling, the structure of its environment, the pattern of its appearances, and the quiet uncertainty of its disappearance. Each of these on its own might not seem extraordinary, but together they create something that resists simple explanation. In the mainstream understanding, this can all be framed within a coherent structure. The ark is a sacred object, central to a specific tradition, whose descriptions reflect theological meaning, whose role is embedded in ritual practice, and whose disappearance is a result of historical events that were not fully recorded. This explanation is grounded, consistent, and supported by what we know about the ancient world. It does not require anything beyond the framework of history and belief as they are commonly understood. But even within that framework, there is still room for careful curiosity. Not because something must be hidden, but because the way the details align invites closer attention. The consistency of the restrictions, the intensity of the reactions, the structure of the experiences, all of these can be observed without needing to step outside what is reasonable. And when we observe them together, we begin to see that the ark may represent not just a single object, but a point where many aspects of human experience converge. There is also something else that becomes clearer as we bring these threads together. The ark's significance does not depend on whether it can be found. Its role in history, in narrative, and in thought is already established. Whether it still exists somewhere, hidden or lost, does not change the fact that it has shaped the way generations have understood presence, authority, and the boundaries between the known and the unknown. In that sense, the search for the ark, while compelling, is only one part of the larger picture. And perhaps this is where the tone of the exploration naturally settles, not in a rush to resolve the question, but in an appreciation of the structure that surrounds it. The ark is a reminder that not all mysteries are meant to be closed. Some remain open, not because they are unsolvable, but because they exist at the intersection of too many layers to be reduced to a single answer. If we return to the beginning, to that quiet image of an object carried through the wilderness, treated with care, surrounded by rules, placed at the center of a people's understanding of themselves, we can see how that image has continued to echo. It has moved through time, through memory, through interpretation, becoming something that is both grounded and elusive at the same time. And as we sit with that, there is no need to decide what the ark ultimately was in any absolute sense. It is enough to recognize what it reveals. It shows us how meaning can be built around an object, how systems can form to protect and define that meaning, how memory can preserve some details while leaving others open, and how absence can continue to shape thought long after presence is gone. So in this part, rather than adding something entirely new, we have allowed the pieces to come together, to settle into a clearer view of the pattern itself. And in doing so, the arc becomes less of a question that demands an answer and more of a structure that invites understanding, one layer at a time, without forcing it into something simpler than it is. As we come to the final part of this quiet exploration, it feels natural not to rush toward a conclusion, but to simply sit with everything that has unfolded, allowing the ideas to settle into a single, calm perspective. Because the Ark of the Covenant, after all we have examined, does not resolve itself into a clear answer. Instead, it remains what it has always been, a point where history, belief, structure, and uncertainty meet, without fully merging into one. We began with something grounded, a constructed object described in detail, built with care, placed at the center of a system that defined how it was approached, how it was understood, and how it was protected. From a mainstream perspective, that alone gives us a stable foundation. The Ark exists within a historical and theological framework that explains its purpose and significance without requiring anything beyond what is already known about the ancient world. It is a sacred chest, a symbol of covenant, a focal point of worship, and a central element in the story of a people moving through time. And yet, even within that grounded understanding, something remains just slightly out of reach. Not because the explanation is insufficient, but because the details themselves carry a certain weight. The precision of its construction, the strictness of its handling, the intensity of the experiences associated with it, the way it appears at moments of transition, always positioned at the edge of change. And then, perhaps most quietly of all, the way it disappears, not with a clear ending, but with a gradual fading that leaves space behind. That space is where the mystery lives, not as something loud or dramatic, but as something subtle. A gap between what is described and what is known, a pause between presence and absence. And it is within that pause that the Ark continues to exist, not as an object that can be examined, but as an idea that can be returned to again and again, each time revealing something slightly different depending on how it is approached. Throughout this exploration, we have avoided the temptation to force the Ark into a single explanation, not because explanations are not valuable, but because in this case, the value lies in holding multiple perspectives carefully at once. The historical view provides structure. The theological view provides meaning. The observational patterns invite curiosity, and together, they create a picture that is complete enough to understand, but open enough to continue thinking about. There is also something quietly important in recognizing that the Ark's mystery does not depend on hidden discoveries or dramatic revelations. It does not require a final moment where everything is suddenly explained. In fact, its enduring presence may come from the opposite, from the fact that it has never been fully resolved, that it continues to sit at the boundary of what can be known and what remains uncertain. If we imagine for a moment that the Ark were found today, clearly identified, studied, and placed within a museum or a controlled environment, something would change. The mystery would narrow. The questions would become more specific, more technical, more contained. And while that would provide answers, it might also remove something that has been part of the Ark's presence for so long, the openness, the sense that it exists not only as a thing, but as a question. And so, as we come to the end, it feels more appropriate to leave that space intact. To recognize that the Ark of the Covenant is not only a subject of history, but a reflection of how we approach the unknown. It reminds us that not everything needs to be resolved to be meaningful, that careful observation can be just as valuable as definitive answers, and that sometimes the most enduring ideas are the ones that remain balanced between clarity and mystery. Because in the end, the Ark is not just about where it is, or what it was made of, or what happened to it. It is about the way it was experienced, the way it was remembered, and the way it continues to invite thought without demanding closure. And perhaps that is the most fitting place to rest. Not with a conclusion, but with a quiet awareness that some questions are not meant to be finished, only followed, slowly, thoughtfully, and with just enough curiosity to keep looking a little longer into the space they leave behind.